Welcome to the inaugural Turing Point Podcast. We're delighted to welcome our experts in AI ethics today. We have Professor Dave Lewis, Head of AI Discipline at the School of Computer Science and Statistics in Trinity College Dublin. He's also Deputy Director of ADAPT Centre. And we have Dr. PJ Wall, Research Fellow and Teaching Fellow at the School of Computer Science and Statistics in Trinity also. He's also a lead in the Integrity H2020 project, which looks at developing interdisciplinary tools for teaching next generation ethics. You're very welcome. Thank you both for agreeing to do this. We'd like to start with if you could tell our listeners about the field of AI ethics and what sort of disciplines or ideas come under this topic.
Grand. Well, perhaps shall I go first, PJ?
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, so I mean, AI ethics is a fairly new field. It's sort of come onto the both the academic and the public policy scene in just the last few years. We started seeing a lot of papers emerging, probably from around sort of 2017, 2018. So, we're still a relatively new field. And obviously it's come to the fore because on the one hand, people are realizing there's huge power potentially behind the technology of AI. Those technologies have been around for a long time. It's advanced in its capabilities, partly due to the amount of data that's now available to both researchers and to companies and governments. And also, our computing power has got to the stage where some approaches that weren't previously tractable now are. So you can actually trace it back probably to it was around 2017. There was a conference in Northern California in the Asilomar conference grounds there, which brought together a lot of people from different disciplines, from industry, from government, lawyers, and ethicists, to discuss this in general alongside the general direction of AI research. And they were one of the first sort of fora that actually laid out some principles for AI ethics, and I think that sort of really got the ball rolling. Then an awful lot of both academic, public policy, and private organizations all started doing quite similar activities.
Yeah, I think that I don't have too much to add to that. That's a really good description of the field and how it's come to prominence, except to say that it is a new field, and it really is applicable to a number of other larger fields. The one that I'm more closely involved in is the implementation of technology in the global south or in poorer countries in the context of the SDGs. So for many years, the question that dominated that academic community was, how do we implement technology? So the technology that we develop is developed by people like us, or perhaps people who are listening to this podcast. We're very well educated. We're based in the global north, dominated by European and US universities. So the kind of technology we develop may not be socially, culturally, or politically appropriate to different contexts. So if it's not appropriate, it fails. It fails not because the technology doesn't work, but because the social and cultural fit is not correct. So I think we've learned how to do that. And the question now is, instead of how do we implement this technology, the question is, should we be implementing this technology at all? Because it has inbuilt into it all of our ethical ideas about what's right and wrong. But again, what's right and wrong in the context of the global north and the kind of education and the kind of backgrounds we come from. So that certainly cannot be applied in a vastly different social and cultural context. So the field of AI ethics is really to the fore in that particular community right now. And the question is, should we be doing this at all? Because we don't know what implications or transformative potential it will have, and whether that's right or not in the context of global ethics.
And perhaps add to that as well, you were asking about the disciplines involved as well, Cathy, and I think it's inherently multidisciplinary area. For sure, I don't think sometimes there's sort of tugs of war over new research areas, especially if there's sort of funding following it. But that hasn't really, I think, panned out against the existing array of disciplines. So if you look at the big sort of academic conferences like FACCT and AIES, they're still by design very multidisciplinary. So you've got, obviously computer scientists engaged, but lawyers, legal scholars, ethicists, social scientists, people involved in media, a whole range of disciplines. And I think that's one of the challenges in the area. Like, it's nice having these very interesting sort of venues where you hear a lot of different voices, but the research challenges mean you have to try and synthesize some of those together. And I think that still remains a bit of a challenge. It's great. Lots of different disciplines have a voice, but trying to combine those effectively, I think, is still something that we need to sort of bottom out a little bit to figure out how best that will work. And you see that a lot in terms of, because particular disciplines aren't tending to dominate the area. There are various sort of institutes being set up in different higher education bodies around the world that tend to be sort of multidisciplinary. So that's our reaction to dealing with multidisciplinary problems, is let's set up an institute so we can get everybody around the table. So that's the sort of phase we're in now. There's quite a few of those being established around the world, specifically to deal with the fact that it doesn't naturally fall within any of our existing academic disciplines.
Thank you. You touched there on one of the key challenges around the sort of interdisciplinarity of the nature of AI ethics. Could you highlight what the current issues or the most common debates that are ongoing in the field at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, again, probably the ones that get discussed probably the most are around issues of sort of bias and discrimination in AI. I feel a little bit that tends to happen because on the one hand, it's potentially quite tractable in terms of statistical analysis and rectification, in rebalancing sort of training sets, etc. So certainly that gets a lot of attention from the computer scientists. And as I say, though one discipline doesn't dominate this, you still get a lot of work from computer scientists because there's lots of them, and they tend to be relatively well funded compared to some of the other disciplines. And then other areas that are much harder, I think, are ones to do with explainable AIs. That's become its own sort of subtopic, which is sort of trying to figure out how AI systems, especially sort of deep learning systems, can sort of explain. They're very opaque the way they do things at the moment. So there's the obvious requirement that we need them even to explain to their own designers how they've come to particular decisions. Otherwise, it's very difficult to sort of deploy those in any sort of system where there's some level of sort of organizational or social oversight. Again, I think that tends to be one that obviously attracts the computer science side of things. And then I think on more broadly, what is interesting is that we are starting to see sort of legislation come into these sort of areas, probably with the EU slightly ahead of the game, but proposals in the US and China and other jurisdictions as well. So the whole area of sort of digital legislation and also I think the overlaps between what can you legislate for and what stuff is still a sort of you still classify it as an ethical issue. You can't sort of solve it either through sort of computing solutions or architectural solutions, and you can't necessarily solve it easily through legislative solutions, just because perhaps the technology is moving on too fast.
Yeah, and I think it's coming into this issue, and these questions are coming into many academic fields. One of the examples that comes into my head was a project that I was working on over the summer of 2021, where we were looking at microneedle patches which are small patches that replace an injection for rollout across West Africa. And these microneedle patches, although they're strictly not AI, I suppose you can lump them in under advanced technology, but they have the potential to completely transform and reconfigure the way that vaccinations are rolled out across very large areas of the world, where it would be difficult to set up vaccination centres like we had for COVID in Ireland, for example. So this particular microneedle patch, the one we were looking at, didn't have approval from the FDA in the US, or it didn't have European approval, but it was imminent. It was about to happen. But it just so happened that the project had been approved by the Ministry of Health in Sierra Leone. So we were faced with a huge ethical question there. And the question was, is it okay, is it ethically correct to roll out a project in West Africa that hadn't been approved in either Europe or the US? Now, that's a very, very tricky ethical question. There are models and frameworks that you can leverage to help you answer that, such as Dave's ethics canvas, which we did use. But I think parts of the arguments and the frameworks that are being used for AI ethics are applicable across anywhere where there is a technological intervention in a different social and cultural environment, or according to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Because these are tricky issues, and the advancement in technology, be it a humble enough technology like a microneedle patch, or advanced technology like a very advanced piece of AI, for example, the ethical dilemmas are the same. And because these are tricky dilemmas, because we can't really see the full transformative potential of these technologies. We don't quite know what they're going to do, I don't think. Dave might disagree with me on that, but we probably don't see everything that they're going to do. Therefore, ethically, there's a lot of considerations we have to take on board before we implement them in a particular environment.
Great. You've sort of answered my next question in terms of with so many different actors involved in the field, are there sort of differences in approach or areas of concern, depending on whether you're coming at it from academia or public policy or a private company, or in different jurisdictions? And you've given us a great example of an application in Sierra Leone. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose, one of the interesting things about the field is you do see very different, type of approaches from different types of scholars, so that sort of, engineering mindset, that sort of characterizes, I think, a lot of computer science is, quite solutionist, like we're saying, okay, you've told me the problem, let's try and find the solution. Whereas I think in many other disciplines, especially in the social science side, you're dealing, you understand the complexity, or you recognize the complexity of what you're dealing with. So actually you spend a lot more time trying to figure out what the problem is in the first place. And also, I think, often, people will come, I think on, from the social sciences, they are more comfortable with coming towards a problem through a political, a particular lens, so I think computer scientists tend to sort of think of themselves as sort of quite neutral in how they address things, which they're completely not. Okay, like nobody's really. That's a problem that they probably don't recognise, that that they're bringing sort of certain values to the table, whereas it tends to be much more explicit in the practice of people in social sciences, or even people doing information systems. Like it's often important that they understand what perspectives they're bringing to the table, and that they're recognizing that as part of their approach. So I think that's I think that's quite important. And I think it was, it's been interesting observing the sort of literature in general, that we've sort of gone through this initial period of lots of papers, revealing problems, saying, oh look, there was this particular case, this shows, power asymmetries, or the lack of attention to sort of biased data sets, or or the way AI can be sort of deliberately misuse or entrench existing sort of inequities out there. And I think we've gone through that sort of process of, oh my god, this is terrible, to sort of starting to think a little bit more, not just what principles we need, but what sort of frameworks we need. And obviously, as you do that, you then start having to, you start to interact with legislation because, as I said earlier, this is starting to appear on the table. So, it becomes more relevant not just to sort of talk about solutions in general, but say actually how can particular approaches fit into, for example, the way the EU is planning to regulate AI. Where are the gaps in that? I do think, though, we still haven't quite got to sort of a fuller empirical sort of turn in AI. We're still, we are starting to see that, and you've done that a little bit. I know, Cathy, in your research, and we see a few other academics doing that. So going not just from individual case studies, but actually looking across ranges of case studies. So, people are starting to do analysis over a large corpora now we have of, various sort of policy and framework documents. And we're also seeing, various groups starting to pull together databases of instance reports, so things that have typically garnered from the press. Okay, that tends to be how these things come to public attention. But both those cases, we're starting to get data sets with several hundred instances of things that we can study, so we can start looking at it a little bit, I wouldn't quite say statistically, but across a bigger data set, rather than running the risk of being sort of skewed by both by your the fact that you're trying to sort of look at things through a certain lens, but also by the fact that you may have trouble generalizing particular mechanisms to help with some of these issues just based on one or two use cases, or just looking at one particular narrow area.
Yeah, I think that's just so important what Dave said there, because the philosophical lens that you adopt to ask these questions, the methodology, the theories you adopt, they all dictate the kind of question you can ask. And I think if you come from an engineering background, or like myself, actually, who comes from an accounting background, where there tends to be a focus on trying to measure things definitively, there tends to be either an answer of black or white. And all of our research frameworks are set up to give us those very concrete, highly positivist answers where you can measure things precisely. Those frameworks begin to break down, I think, when we apply them to the study of ethics, where there is rarely a black or a white answer. Instead, there's 1,000 shades of gray, particularly when we're building in these kinds of technologies in different social and cultural contexts. So the approach requires a different way of looking at this from a philosophical perspective. A philosophical approach or a theoretical approach which will give us those shades of grays instead of trying to get definitive answers. And I think particularly engineers, maybe accountants like me in the dim and distant past, we have to look beyond these kinds of positivist, highly quantitative approaches to much more interpretivist or critical realist approaches, which do give subtlety in the answer, which recognize that what's right maybe in the global north or in Ireland or in Trinity is not necessarily always right in a different context, maybe among travelers or among people in Africa or among people in China. So what Dave said there is actually really important. It's the adoption of alternative philosophical and theoretical approaches, I think, and that's a key part of being able to answer these questions appropriately.
Great, thank you. Our listeners, and hopefully we have more than one, are largely students in AI, maybe in sort of more hard computer science subjects or research. Why should these students consider ethics? Why, if it's nothing to do with your project, or you think it's not really relevant to your research, what would you say?
Well, I would say it is starting to become, more relevant from a practical point of view. So, if people are halfway through their PhD, by the time they finish in a couple of years and go out into practice, probably there will be, actual regulations expecting product developers, people in design teams who are developing AI systems are going out to the market to run risk assessments, there will be a practical aspect to the jobbing sort of AI expert that they have to deal with this, so that there's certainly an aspect to that, and there is, but in doing that, I think there is an element of sort of self-reflection and understanding the context that you're really working in, that you need to apply, that you can argue is a little bit more of an ethical outlook than just following the regulations. So sometimes regulations can be sort of distilled down to sort of a box ticking exercise. So I do a lot of work in international standards around AI, and that's what we're trying to do, is normalize what are the things that you need to consider in building an AI system, with the intention that those standards are things you would follow, a bit like an ISO 9000 sort of quality standard, when you're developing a system that is in a regulatory regime, where you need to show that you've considered a number of issues. But I think that doesn't make the ethical issues go away, and I think that the reason for that is because the field just moves forward so quickly. So in regulation, we're very familiar with this idea of the pacing problem, that it takes us longer to put the regulations in place than for technology than it does for the technology to itself to evolve. So we're revealing and inventing new ethical issues quicker than we can come up with solutions, and that's an important part of building regulation and standards, is that they're sort of can attempt to be fairly evergreen, but we still need to go forward with the basis that they need to be flexible. They need to be things that can be updated and adapted. So I think that's important. And also just even before we necessarily going in the industry, increasingly conferences like Europe's are asking people to talk a little bit in their papers about any technology ethics that they've considered. So that's not, have you done your study in an ethical way, which often you're not even using human subjects in AI, you're just taking somebody else's data set. So you dodge all of that bothersome, research ethics thing. But technology ethics is thinking ahead a little bit. So, well, if this was actually, licensed, my research was licensed by a company and put into a product, what would be the issues there? Could it be used maliciously, or could it be used in a way that I wouldn't be happy with, or does expose a new vulnerability for a certain group in society? So getting used to sort of thinking about that is really important. And I think especially for computer scientists, because we haven't ever had a sort of a history of being very exposed to a professional code of practice. So you can join the IEEE or the ACM, and they have ethical codes of practice, and that's obviously something we'd like to encourage our students to do, and we're required to do in the practice of our own research. But we don't work in an area where that's really necessary to practice. It's not like working as a doctor or a lawyer where you properly take an oath about these things, and if you don't practice in the right way and you breach well described ethical guidelines, you can be barred from practicing. And I can't see that happening anytime soon for computer scientists. I think partly because I think the probably too easy to become a computer scientist compared to a doctor or a lawyer, so it's difficult to sort of really control the job market. And the vast majority of that work is actually done in the private sector. Like law and medicine is, though largely private, is heavily engaged with government rules and public practice. So they're much, they had to be more constrained in their sort of professional ethics than computer scientists, sort of, or at least to date, being able to get away with whatever they want without much regulation at all. And that certainly is going to change, but it's not at all clear to me that will result in particularly more professionalization of practitioners, because I think there's the demand for the skills is so high. And also I think it's rare. I mean, I'm not really to mean the skills, but you can sit in your bedroom and do a lot of online courses and learn to be very good at machine learning without necessarily having to be, and I'm talking my university out of a job now, but without having to qualify through practice like you have to if you're a lawyer or a doctor, or even someone like an actor. Like you can't just do it independently through bookwork and then go out onto the job market in those areas. But you absolutely can do that in computer science, because it's such an international market. It's very difficult to regulate. So we're buying software from people all around the world, whereas really we can only go to lawyers and doctors in our own country. So the government role in regulation is there. So I think it is. I think these issues are going to be something we're going to be forced to do as professionals. So it actually puts the onus on us to undertake the learning we need to do to act in a good way. And of course, at the end of the day, everybody has to look at their face in the mirror every morning, and there's an element that are you happy with doing that? And I think individuals obviously understand that, and free to make their own decisions where they sit. But you see that a lot with the big tech companies. They realize that actually there's bigger problem for them if they're caught in some sort of ethical malfeasance with their products. They may lose some public trust, but if they start, they could use PR to get around that. But if they lose the confidence of their employees, and the good employees don't want to work for them, then they're in real trouble, because none of these companies can really go forward without the top end skills. So, tech workers have a bit of sort of leverage there that they should be practicing.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with all of that yet again. I believe ultimately people want to do the right thing, or what they consider to be the right thing. But that's tricky. It's tricky to figure out what the right thing to do is. So if we have somebody graduating from one of our wonderful computer science degrees and they're offered a job with an autonomous weapons company or developing some sort of autonomous drone for the US military, is it the right thing to go and take that job, or is it not? Well, that's actually not an easy question. So I think there's an obligation on us to develop some sort of framework or some sort of guidance in how to make that decision, because again, it's not one of these black and white decisions. The other reason I think students and all of us, in fact, should be paying very close attention to ethics is because this is becoming a much stricter requirement with publications. If we're working in academia, the ethical implications of our work, that's becoming much more important for publishing our research, and particularly for funding. So a number of the recent funding applications I've been involved in have had a huge ethical consideration built in, where you really have to look at the ethical implications of exactly what you're proposing and exactly what you're hoping to do. And just finally, I think those of us, again, who are in this field, we really have to be aware of ethical implications if we want our technology to succeed and if we want it to have impact. So if myself and Dave and you, Cathy, got our heads together and developed some sort of an AI system to do something in Ireland, I'm sure it would be successful and it would work, because we all come from a similar background, we have similar levels of education, we think similarly. So that wouldn't be a problem. I think that would work. But as soon as we try to bring that outside of our own social group or outside of our own racial group, it begins to become problematic then, because the ethics that the three of us have, or people listening to this podcast might have, could potentially be very, very different to somebody who's homeless, somebody who's from an ethnic minority, somebody who's from a racial minority, somebody who's oppressed, somebody living in a very poor part of the world. And if that gap is big, if the ethical gap is quite big, there's a much greater chance of the technology failing. So if we do want, for example, to apply our considerable expertise to solving the climate crisis and preventing an obscure part of the world, let's say like the Solomon Islands, from becoming completely immersed in water or completely submerged over the next number of years, I think ethically we do have to pay close attention to the kind of things that our populations, are the people who we're working for, developing solutions for, the ethical considerations and the ethical beliefs that they have. So I think we can't just assume, we can't ignore this, as Dave said, and we can't assume that everybody has the same notions of right and wrong that we do, because they definitely don't. Again, a thousand shades of gray here, and it's really difficult to figure out which one is the most appropriate one.
Thank you very much. Time is not on our side, so we're just going to go to the final question. And if you could frame this in a couple of sentences each, that would be great. If you had to pick one area to keep an eye on in AI ethics for over the next, I would say the near future, what would it be?
Yeah, well, for my money, I think it's interesting as we look at the sort of new, perhaps regulatory approaches, to really look carefully at, you know, where is the sort of the citizen's voice in that, or the stakeholder voice in that, because there's a tendency to approach this in a very sort of technocratic approach. So the EU's AI regulatory proposal, you know, really doesn't have any sort of role for external stakeholder voices, and that's, you know, people pointing that out, and hopefully that will change, you know, and it's partly because it's technical, it's very difficult, needs a lot of expertise at the moment, but we're dealing with issues that, you know, at the end of the day are to do with ethical issues, to do with sort of asymmetries of power, which is a big thing, particularly for AI. And, you know, we have to sort of learn to resolve those sort of big issues in the same way we resolve those if we were talking about housing, for example, you know, and that we have a public debate, and we have an informed public debate, and you know, ultimately it becomes a political issue, you know. So it's interesting now, sort of starting to work a little bit more, you know, lawyers are getting into issues like digital constitutionalism, and we're starting to engage a little bit more with more political scientists as well, so actually looking at this, saying, how do we put up the mechanisms in place so people can actually both be educated in it, in the issues, and have a clear voice, because I think leaving this to the experts is not a good way forward, just on a matter of principle.
Great.
I think for me, it's climate change and sustainability. I'm a huge believer that technology can solve many of these issues, maybe not by itself, but I think technology and some of the advances that are going to happen over the next decade can definitely go some way towards that. The ethical issues here are absolutely huge. I mean, really, the people who consume, the people in the global north, are going to have a very serious conversation with themselves, I suppose, to ask, is it ethical that I upgrade to the latest phone every 2 years, or is it ethically the right position that I adopt the latest technology to do a certain thing, like should I get the new laptop, or will the existing one be good enough? So these are going to be very, very tricky issues. And I think, again, at the risk of repeating myself, but again, I think that there are different ethical beliefs and ethical considerations for people in all over the world, different parts of the world. And I think that this conversation is really important for all the reasons they've said, but also from the point of view of us maybe having to look at this much more seriously and ask ourselves really hard questions about what we're doing and whether that is contributing to make climate change worse, or maybe if we can do something which is ethically more appropriate in order to solve some of these huge big picture issues.
Thank you both so much. And I'm glad that we get to leave it on a sort of a positive note, in that we know the technology can have a positive impact, but it's up to us to work through those ethical issues to make sure that we're not increasing the harm, but that we're actually empowering people, the citizenry, as Dave mentioned, but also that in the application of the technology, we are doing more good than bad. So thank you both so much for your time. That was a fantastic discussion. I can see a part 2 coming up in our near future. I'm sure our listeners will be fascinated to follow this discussion further. Thank you again, PJ and Dave.
Thank you, Cathy.
Yeah, Cathy. Cheers.